There's a young boy, looks like he's collapsed outside. He looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something.
The inadequate investigation by the Metropolitan Police into the deaths of Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel and Jack should be on public record as one of the most widespread institutional failings in modern history.
They were discriminated against from the very beginning, whether that had been they were just seen as a druggie, homeless, gay. It's not acceptable.
Looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's just always just drunk.
Those were grave errors, and we are very sorry that they happened.
Jack and I have been following the case of the Metropolitan Police's inquiries into the deaths of 4 young men in East London on separate dates between June 2014 and September 2015.
The case has become known as the Grindr Killer, after the use of that and other hookup sites used by gay men.
The killer was Stephen Port, a childlike 40-year-old loner with a liking for having sex with young gay men. Port met them through various gay contact sites. Having met them and taken them to his flat, he would stupefy them with the date rape drug GHB, with the intention of raping them. This may have been within hours of meeting them or after a longer relationship. Anthony Walgate, June 2014, found dead outside Port's flat on Cook Street in Barking, East London, in the early hours of the morning. Port called an ambulance and falsely claimed to have discovered Anthony in a drugged state. Cause of death: an overdose of GHB. Gabriel Kovari, August 2014, found dead in St Margaret's churchyard, Barking, by a dog walker less than a quarter of a mile from Port's flat. Cause of death: an overdose of GHB. Daniel Whitworth, September 2014, found dead in St Margaret's churchyard by the same dog walker. Cause of death: an overdose of GHB. Jack Taylor died in September 2015 and found in the same position as the others, by the churchyard wall.
It's worth noting here that Port was arrested within a week or so of the first death because, realising Mr. Walgate was in a bad way, he moved him out of the flat and left him outside, then called an ambulance, claiming to have come across the unconscious man.
There's a young boy, looks like he's collapsed outside. He looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's just always just drunk.
Sure, there were errors in terms of submitting items for examination, and there were errors in communication between fellow officers and departments. That said, I have some sympathy with the officers involved. As a former major crime detective, I'll try and explain why. And this is not out of some closed-rank loyalty to the job. It's the reality of the job. It can be incessant for detectives working on division. Establishment figures are down by about a third from 2010, and there's a lack of experienced detectives in some areas.
OK, and we need to highlight that the original inquests into each of the deaths returned open verdicts. That's very important.
That's a good point too, Simon. Now, the coroner's office has oversight of all sudden deaths within their area. Did the coroner put up a red flag at any stage? We'll come on to the fact that the major investigation teams that deal with all homicides didn't take on any of the cases because they weren't identified as homicides until the 4th death. There's a need for all agencies, to flag things up, and the coroner has a lot of clout.
Well, Nadia-Persaud was the coroner at the original inquests. She is recorded as saying that she had, quote, some concerns surrounding Mr. Whitworth's death which have not been answered by the police investigation, unquote. Daniel Whitworth was the 3rd person to die. Ms. Persaud's statement continued, most concerning are the findings by the pathologist of manual handling prior to his death, and noted that the bedsheet that he was found wrapped in was not forensically analysed, and the bottle of GBL which was found near him was also not tested for fingerprints or DNA. I think you'll find that GBL is a very similar drug to GHB.
OK, now maybe this comes down to the supervision of each sudden death investigation. In cases like these, the officer would spend only a couple of days on them, hopefully secure potential evidence and submit it for forensic analysis. After those few days, these cases drop down the officer's in tray. A sudden death investigation leads to a coroner's file, and these are nowhere near the level of detail in a crime file.
That's interesting. So, OK, who investigates the sudden deaths? The call comes in, there's a deceased person in a churchyard. Who deals with it?
Well, initially the nearest officer available, a supervisor would attend. Procedures normally require an inspector to attend and give it the once-over. It basically falls on whichever shift was available at the time. Now, once the scene is managed and the body goes to the mortuary, the decision-making starts to settle down. Someone is allocated to view the body. If there are no marks of violence or other factors, then it's an unexplained death. The post-mortem could then be the following day, ideally the same officer or their shift, but it could even be handed over.
And I suppose if the post-mortem examination doesn't answer the questions, then toxicology will be the next thing, a blood or a urine sample to look for drugs or poisoning, yeah?
Yes, and it takes days to get those results.
So, in the meantime, who deals with the investigation? Is it always the CID?
Not at all. It would be allocated in an almost informal way. It's often down to the supervisor on the day. They could speak to the detectives, or they may choose to deal with it if they had the capacity. Usually an officer would volunteer to do it. That could be a detective, or it could be an ideal job for a probationer officer to deal with their first coroner's file, under supervision, of course.
You mentioned the coroner's file. In my experience, the coroner in England and Wales is empowered to order or conduct an inquest into the manner or cause of death and to establish the identity of any person who's been found dead within their jurisdiction.
Yes, in short, they need to know who died, how they died, and why.
Well, the coroner who handled the initial inquest for Daniel Whitworth, when she gave evidence at the full inquest, mentioned the bedsheet that Whitworth was wrapped in.
Well, if an open verdict was recorded at the first inquest, the implication is that Daniel Whitworth died while sleeping rough after taking a fatal level of GHB, isn't it?
Yes, it would appear so, but then there was a suicide note in which Daniel Whitworth claimed responsibility for the death of Gabriel Kovari, the second man to die, whose body was found in the same churchyard.
That's right. The suicide note that we now know Stephen Port had faked. That's certainly poor case management. Suicide notes should always be verified as to who wrote them.
Yeah, and especially when they contain phrases like, "By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night." What guy would that be then? I'm no expert on suicide notes, but this one was more than 150 words long. It included the confession by Gabriel Kovari. It was apparently written at the scene as Daniel lapsed into unconsciousness, but the words are legible and consistent, like whoever wrote it was leaning on a flat surface and was compos mentis at the time. He says, "Feeling dizzy now as I took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing." There's a handy hint about where he might have dropped his mobile phone, and the note was wrapped in a plastic bag so it didn't get wet. At the very least, I would say the coroner could have done more to flag that up. Do you agree?
I suppose I am at least bound to say that the original inquests should have been a good test of the level of investigation at the time. The coroner felt able to return an open verdict. If the bedsheet was so crucial to the inquest, the hearing could have been adjourned. And, of course, Stephen Port was already on bail, having been arrested shortly after the first death for lying about the circumstances of Walgate's death.
He was, And there was an even more crucial oversight on this one, bearing in mind it was a criminal investigation of perverting the course of justice in lying about how he died. This was when the detectives had seized Stephen Port's laptop, but didn't submit it for examination for 10 months.
Exactly. When it was looked at, it revealed what Port had been searching for on the internet in the days before Anthony Walgate was killed. He searched for, and I quote, "gay unconscious boys date drug raped videos," and "unconscious teen boys drug raped videos."
Well, that's chilling, isn't it? If it had been known to detectives sooner, then surely, the murder squad could have taken that on.
It is, and I do know from experience, though, that sometimes items are not submitted for examination when they should have been. Maybe they thought they had enough data from his mobile phone use. It's difficult to say. But the laptop was seized for a reason, and it should have been submitted soon after Port's initial arrest. The turnaround time to receive the download from it may have taken several weeks, possibly months. But it would have shown a very sinister side to Stephen Port.
When they were investigating the sudden death of Anthony Walgate, the local detectives did refer the case to the murder squad, but the murder squad didn't take it on. How significant was that?
It has to be significant with hindsight. The local detectives were, as the detective inspector put it at the main inquest, working relentlessly in difficult conditions. Now, this was one sudden death within their workload. Bear in mind, too, that sudden death reports and coroner's files are not always dealt with by detectives. The murder squad had been appraised, and they did not take it on as a homicide, so the death of Anthony Walgate remained a sudden death, another drugs death, with the added complication of a witness, Stephen Port, moving the body from his flat to try and hide the fact that he'd been with him and had actually hired him as a gay escort.
And what we know now, with the intention of raping him in an unconscious state.
Yes. Now that's another strange facet to this case. Port was looking for sex with a consenting male, the hired escort, but was plying him with GHB, so he could satisfy his fantasies of raping an unconscious man. That's what the initial investigation could have discovered from Stephen Port's internet history. It's just that the overworked local detective dealing with it must have felt they had enough to prosecute Port for perverting the course of justice.
Interesting. It's worth adding that GHB isn't exclusively used by gay men. It's a recreational drug used in the club scene these days. It is, though, particularly dangerous because it has what's called a narrow therapeutic window. In plain English, that means it's easy to take an overdose. 0.5 milliliter over the dose can lead to coma and death. Gamma-hydroxy-butyrate, to give it its proper name, was used as an anaesthetic back in the 60s, but was abandoned in humans because it is so easy to administer an overdose, and it was superseded by more sophisticated sedatives like gamma-butyrolactone, which has the street name GBL. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. Bottom line, GHB is for putting people and animals to sleep. So when a vet does the kind thing and euthanizes a poorly pet, they simply administer an overdose of gamma-hydroxy-butyrate.
Now, Stephen Port would have known this, of course. He used it himself. He knew the fine line between the euphoric high and becoming unconscious.
Let's think for a moment about the pressures on policing a busy subdivision, like you mentioned at the start, Jack. At the inquest, as reported by the London Evening Standard, Detective Inspector Kirk described having to deal with hundreds of crimes every day. Those are his words, meaning long-term investigations had to, quote, take a back seat, unquote. He told inquest jurors at Barking Town Hall, "I'm not going to excuse what happened, but these were not officers who were lazy. they were working relentlessly in difficult conditions with very little reward or recognition.
So, with Port on bail for perverting the course of justice, the coroner's file goes in about the sudden death of Anthony Walgate. Then, the deaths of Cavari and Whitworth. Both are dealt with as sudden deaths due to an overdose of GHB. 2 more coroner's files, and 2 more open verdicts. Whatever the mistakes in these cases, they were coroner's files and not criminal investigations. There was evidence available that showed Port was involved with both men, but that level of investigation was not required for the coroner's file. The note suggesting Whitworth felt responsible for Cavari's overdose being the standout error in that investigation.
Despite Port plying 2 more men with fatal doses of GHB and moving them, this time to the graveyard, Port's only involvement with the police is in relation to Mr. Walgate's death. At a hearing on the 23rd of March 2015, Port pleaded guilty to perverting the course of justice and was sentenced to 8 months imprisonment. He was out within 10 weeks, released with an electronic tag on the 4th of June.
Coincidentally, also in June 2015, the inquests into the deaths of Mr. Cavari and Mr. Whitworth both delivered an open verdict.
So, Stephen Port is free to change his ways or seek to rape an unconscious young man again. His perverted sexual appetite got the better of him. This time, Jack Taylor was lured into his trap. After communicating with Port on Grindr, he agreed to meet him and travelled to Barking, arriving at 3 o'clock in the morning. His body was found the following day.
Again, a sudden death, an overdose of GHB, and a relatively low-key investigation by a local officer. Part of that investigation was to recover CCTV to see who he may have met and where he went prior to his death. There was footage showing Taylor in company with a tall man who would need to be traced as a witness. After all, he was probably the last person to see Mr. Taylor alive, the kind of detail needed for a coroner's file to ascertain who, how, and when a person died. An image of the tall man was circulated a month after Jack Taylor's death.
Cue Detective Inspector Kirk again. He said it was, I quote, a truly goosebumps moment when one of his detectives who'd worked on the Anthony Walgate investigation recognised Stephen Port as the unidentified man on the CCTV. Whatever mistakes, errors or omissions had gone before, involving several officers and personnel, this was the moment that sealed the fate of the Grindr Killer. Jack, the full inquest heard a lot of evidence from the relatives of these 4 men. It was felt that the investigation showed institutional bias because of their sexuality. Whilst this was not found to be the case, it is something that the LGBT community felt and still feel. The inquest jury also heard from the police about a meeting 2 days after Mr. Whitworth's body was found in St. Margaret's Churchyard. While an advisor on rough sleeping had been invited to attend that meeting, no member of the LGBT community was asked to give their perspective. The officer accepted that with hindsight he could have engaged more with the LGBT community. Do you agree with that?
There are always learning opportunities when cases are scrutinised like this. It would, of course, depend on who and whether someone did attend, what they would have been able to bring to the meeting or to take back to the LGBT community. From what I've read, it seems that all of the men didn't have a reason to visit Barking other than their online activity with Stephen Port, and that's a sad truth.
And to be fair, it also mentioned that Port used different names and profiles on gay dating sites, including Grindr.
Yes, and of course, these liaisons may have been kept discreet for various reasons. It was the perfect environment for Stephen Port to satisfy his sexual urges. In fact, I think Mr. Cavari had been staying with Port for around 5 days before he died.
It seems to me, Jack, that if the police had identified that the suicide note was a fake, and you say that the handwriting on a suicide note should always be checked, that would have blown the case wide open, right?
Indeed. It would have shown that a third party was covering up something. Maybe then there would have been a briefing involving the detectives and others who could well have brought Stephen Port into the equation again. On the 23rd of November 2016, Port was convicted of the assaults by penetration, rapes and murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth and Jack Taylor. Also the rapes of 3 other men he'd drugged, and 10 counts of administering a substance with intent and 4 sexual assaults. In total, 11 men were known victims of Stephen Port's crimes. He was found guilty on all counts.
Commenting on the case, Malcolm McAfee, Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor for London, said, "Over a period of 3 years, the defendant committed a series of murders and serious sexual offences against young men. Port manipulated and controlled these men through the chilling and calculated use of the drug GHB, which he administered without their permission. This was a technically challenging case," Malcolm McAfee continued, "complicated by a significant amount of evidence taken from the numerous social media sites Port used."
An awful case that's been scrutinised many times. What's the answer? You've heard our take on it. How do we stop people like Stephen Port?
And equally important, how do we protect people like Anthony, Gabriel, Daniel and Jack? On Twitter, we're at PsychoKillerPo, and our website is psycho-killer.co. From me, Simon Ford, and Jacques Morrell, it's goodbye for now. Join us again soon on the dark side for another Psycho Killer shocking true crime story.